Hello, I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible. Flash photography confuses a lot of people, and they don't understand the difference between high-speed sync and hypersync or T1 times and what is actually going on. So let's actually first take a duration of time up here when it regards our shutter time. Let's say we got a huge fat duration of like 1/30th of a second or 1/15th of a second of time. On typical DSLRs and most mirrorless cameras, the sync speed is 1/250th of a second. Yeah, which is a much shorter period of time than 1/30th of a second, right? The issue comes into when we're talking about hypersync and high-speed sync and differentiating out these two and actually understanding lighting ratios and what controls what, because typically shutter speed obviously controls your ambient illumination. Of course, it also controls it can be controlled, obviously, so through aperture. You close down the aperture, you can get less lighting on your ambient also. But when it comes to flash photography and you have to worry about lighting ratios, your shutter controls your ambient and your aperture controls your flash, and of course the power. And this, of course, is the reason why light meters measure the output or answer that you're looking for in aperture that you should adjust and not in time. And there's a reason for that. Let's actually try to simplify flash photography very, very simply here. Kind of sounded redundant there. You actually have two curtains. There's actually a window that sits over top of your sensor, which of course is the shutter mechanism, and it contains two curtains, kind of like the old days. The movie curtains would open from left to right. You actually have two curtains. You have a first curtain that's already falling here. Let's say it's already fallen past the bottom half of the frame, and then the second curtain right here. Our second curtain is here, and our first curtain is here. The second curtain is starting to fall, but during that brief period of time when, of course, the flash fires, and this, of course, is your sync speed. Now, of course, like on a GFX camera, the sync speed is 1/125th of a second, and we'll talk about that in just a second. We actually have this duration of time here, a moment in window in which the flash can actually fire and expose the entire sensor all at once before the second curtain starts to fall. And this, of course, is what happens. Remember, the bottom of your image is always the top of the sensor. People will not get their sync speeds right. They'll accidentally shoot regular flash photography, not high-speed sync, but regular flash photography, let's say 1/500th of a second, and they'll wonder why there's a banding on the bottom of their image, which of course is actually the top of the sensor in correct orientation, because the bottom of your image is the top of the sensor. And this is, of course, where we actually have to worry about the entire sensor being covered. And let's quickly go on to GFX. We're not talking about medium format versus other formats here. We're just actually talking about the mechanisms of time and flash photography. We actually have, of course, a larger sensor. And so for the duration, the shorter, the duration that we actually have for syncing it up between when the second curtain falls and the first curtain has already covered the sensor, we actually only have 1/120th of a second. We actually have a much broader period of time where we actually can't crush out the ambient illumination, and this creates issues in lighting ratios where you want to drown out the ambient and expose for your subject. And of course, it also is an issue with stopping motion. Obviously, the higher the shutter speed, the more you can stop the motion. So when you're actually drowning out your ambient illumination for your lighting, you need to take into consideration lighting ratios. I notice that none of the photography channels on YouTube, for some strange reason, don't talk about lighting ratios. Let's actually talk about what high-speed sync is versus high-speed sync. And by the way, hypersync versus a high-speed sync. Excuse me, I'm always thinking about 10 things at once while I'm doing stuff. And now let's actually take a shorter period of time, say 1/125th, 1/125th, and an even shorter one. Typical sync speed for most DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, 1/250th of a second. And of course, we want to go even shorter than that to crush out our... Remember, shutter speed mostly controls when you're working with mixed lighting, and all flash photography is a dual exposure. And by that, of course, I mean that your ambient illumination is your one exposure, and your second exposure is, of course, the flash, which actually, of course, stops motion. If it's completely dark and you do flash photography and your shutter speed is, say, 1 second long, you're still with the speed light, because the typical speed light flash duration is 1/13,000th of a second. This means that your motion is going to be stopped, even though the shutter speed on your camera is, say, 1/500th or 1/2000th of a second. If we want to shoot at 1/500th of a second, what the issue comes into play, and people always ask about this, is they do a high-speed sync flash photography outdoors for crushing the ambient illumination. Obviously, you raise your shutter speed from your sync speed, and you do some high-speed flash photography. You go from 1/250th, which is insufficient. And of course, there are ways around this with a ND filter. You want to bring it up to, say, 1/2000th of a second. Okay, and then you can't get your subject that far away with a speed light. The speed light has a relatively tiny capacitor in it, and in doing high-speed sync flash photography, let's take a look at our flash duration time. Let's look at it in an expanded fashion at, say, 1/2000th of a second, even though it's a short duration of time. Let's take a look at 1/2000th of a second. The way high-speed sync flash photography works, since 1/2000th, since you're actually, and this is your sensor and your shutter mech, we could look at it as one window. Instead of the entire sensor being open during its sync speed, which would be 1/250th, for example, we're now dealing with 1/2000th of a second. And so instead of a first curtain, having already fallen, and the second curtain about to starting to fall, and the entire sensor being exposed, what we actually have now is we actually have a moving slit. Repeat after me: moving slit. It's actually much smaller than this. It should be like this, and it moves from top to bottom. This moving slit, where the sensor is exposed, of course, moves from top to bottom. And the way your speed light accomplishes this, and it works hard to do it, but it also generates a lot less power to cover that very short duration of time. Even though it's a shorter duration of time, the speed light has an issue covering it, and it has much less power because we actually have now a moving slit. And so there is no point in time which the entire sensor is open. So now what it has to do, instead of dropping one big pulse of light like it would at its sync speed of, say, 1/250th, yes, it now actually has to do this number: boom, 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 boom. Now, you can't see this when you do high-speed sync flash photography, but to cover that much shorter duration, which is to cover the moving slit on the sensor, the speed light actually has to drop all these pulses. And the issue with that is that little tiny capacitor can only charge and discharge so damn fast. And so your power level for normal flash photography goes from this, and it drops way the hell down here in the basement. People are like, oh my god, I'm doing high-speed sync photography, and it seems like my flash is dying. Something is wrong. Yeah, well, what's wrong is the limitations of the actual capacitor on your speed light. This is why speed lights are not capable of hypersync flash photography. What units are capable of that, I know Godox is working on one now. I know Paul C. Buff is working on one now. Is that, let's take a normal speed light pulse duration, which would cover 1/250th of a second, or 1/125th, 2/50th. Okay, now what we actually have is a huge bank of capacitors in a large unit, like a Paul C. Buff White Lightning for a unit, for example. You have a huge atomic bomb burst of light that now I put within this a time duration. I can have in here 1/250th of a second. Okay, I could put in here 1/500th of a second. I could put in here 1/5000th of a second. Doesn't matter what you got, the huge pulse of light will cover the shutter duration. There's a downside to this, of course, but it's not a huge downside. That the lighting is such that your color control is a little bit askew. There's no IGBT flash control in White Lightning units like there is in a Paul C. Buff Einstein. But we need to understand lighting ratios, and nobody on YouTube, for some really, really strange reason, understands lighting ratios. When you actually have control over your subject, you also have control over your background. And let's see, I bring this here. So I'm going to do a stick figure. This could be our subject, and of course back here is our background. Yay, here's our subject. Isn't this some fantastic drawing? You got some mountains in the background. Since shutter controls your ambient and aperture mainly controls your flash, of course aperture also controls ambient, obviously so. Some mountains back here. Someone's going to make some sort of crude joke, and we got our sun up here. Yeah, it's bearing down. Of course you want some nice bokeh, and you want to... I'm not talking about flash duration time now, but you actually want to control the ratios between your ambient, the big A, and your subject here. This is, yeah, Susie here. Control the lighting ratios between your subject and your ambient. All you have to do is just drop down your shutter speed to a shorter duration to crush out the ambient illumination, because it's just too bright, right? Okay, you crush out your ambient illumination, and you raise your subject illumination with your flash. When you actually have control over your subject illumination with your speed light or your studio strobe, you also have control over your ambient. You have to, of course, take into consideration high-speed sync, HYPERSYNC considerations of what your flash and your camera is capable of. But I mean, I just wanted to make it clear in what we're talking about on the moving slits and your shutter mech, and what the distinction is between HYPERSYNC and high-speed sync. Let's actually draw that again really quickly here. Is your shutter mech window and your sensor. It doesn't make any difference. But when we actually have the moving slit here, this is the second curtain starting to fall, and this is the first curtain, which is already falling. There is this traveling, moving slit on your sensor that needs to be covered one or two ways. There's only two ways that you can actually cover for shutter speeds above the sync speed of your camera. The two ways of covering it are, with a lot less power, of course, high-speed sync pulse bursts from your speed light, which radically drops in power. So you just have this boom, 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 boom. And it's just covering the moving slit from top to bottom on your sensor. And the only other way you could cover it, and of course requires a much larger unit, doesn't have to be as large as a Pulsey Buff White Lightning. There are several different HYPERSYNC units, as you cover the entire moving slit with an enormous atomic bomb of light, boom, that covers the entire moving slit from start to finish. And that, of course, is larger, it's more expensive, and the color control is much less. But I just wanted to, just give you a brief insight into, the considerations of what you need to think about. What's the distinction between high-speed sync and HYPERSYNC? High-speed sync, humorously I've said, is basically the douche version of HYPERSYNC. HYPERSYNC units, of course, cost a lot more, and they're more expensive, but you have to deal with a moving slit. The moving slit on your sensor, and you have to understand what sync speed is. Also T1 time. T1 time is the pulse duration of the light, typically the flash duration. And this, of course, is the reason why Godox actually has an offset in the most of the trigger units for letting you move like a typical pulse duration or T1 time of a flash is about like this. The typical pulse duration of a HYPERSYNC unit, which is a huge burst of light, is like this. So this, of course, right here covers a lot more time than does, of course, this, which would be the pulse burst. You actually have this amount of the majority, 90% of the light, versus this from the HYPERSYNC unit covering this much. So I've posted videos on the best flash photography books to get, and just learn about lighting rate. Lighting ratios are incredibly important. When you actually understand lighting ratios, and you control your ambient control your subject illumination, you can therefore actually change your shutter speed and your aperture to. Also, one last thing I wanted to mention, because I'm always thinking about 10 things at once. The reason why, and I get asked this question all the time. Let's say we actually have a duration of time here. This is the reason why light meters don't output the answer that you're looking for in shutter speed. Let's say this is 1/30th of a second here, this is 1/125th here, and this is 1/500th here, and 1/2000th here. the reason why when you change your shutter speed, this confuses the hell out of people. When you change your shutter speed, let's draw this, there you go. When you change your shutter speed, doesn't matter where I'm at here, since the typical speedlight flash duration is an average about 1/13,000th of a second. It doesn't matter whether you change your shutter from 1/30th or 1/250th or 1/500th. The flash pulse duration, where all the light for your subject illumination is dropping, is 1/13,000th of a second, which we're looking at this. And obviously it doesn't matter, you're shooting 1/2000th, your speed light is covering it. 1/500th, speed light's covering it. 1/250th, 1/30th, it doesn't matter. And this is, of course, this is time, right? More time over here. 1/30th of a second, 1/250th of a second, 1/500th of a second. This is the reason why when you actually change your shutter speed, and of course you still have high-speed sync flash consideration, that's of course is relevant to banding issues, that your speed light time duration, or T1 time, from a typical speed light T1 time, is covering all of these different shutter speeds. Regardless of, I'm changing my shutter speed, my lighting hasn't changed. Well, your ambient lighting changes because your shutter speed mostly affects ambient illumination, but shutter speed does not affect a hypersonic pulse burst at 1/13,000th of a second average at basically 1/2 or 1/4 power, depends on the speed light. I have an actual device for measuring T1 time from flash outputs and studio strobes and speed lights, but it doesn't affect it. This is the reason why when you change your shutter speed, it doesn't affect the flash illumination for your subject illumination. Anyway, I said too much. I talked too far. I hope I didn't convolute things. Thanks so much for watching.